My name is Claire Morgan, and I learned exactly what my family thought of me 3 hours after we buried my grandmother. Most people assume a story like this begins with a funeral because funerals are where obvious heartbreak happens. Looking back, I understand why they think that. Funerals have all the things people associate with grief. Flowers arranged around polished caskets. Carefully prepared speeches about love and legacy. Relatives embracing each other while promising to stay close even though everyone quietly understands that most of them will return to their normal lives by the following week. The problem is that obvious heartbreak rarely destroys a family. The things that destroy families usually happen much more quietly. They happen through years of small decisions that nobody questions because questioning them would make everyone uncomfortable. A favor becomes an expectation. An expectation becomes a responsibility. A responsibility becomes a role. Then one day you realize the people around you stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as something useful. My grandmother, Evelyn Morgan, was 79 when she passed away, and she was the only person in my family who ever seemed to notice that difference. She wasn't the kind of grandmother people describe as sweet and harmless. She was intelligent, observant, and sometimes intimidating. If she asked a question, she genuinely wanted the answer. If she gave advice, it usually sounded unnecessary until 6 months later when you realized she had understood a problem before anyone else even noticed it existed. During the final years of her life, I spent nearly every Sunday afternoon sitting in her kitchen drinking coffee and listening to her talk about everything from politics to gardening. Those afternoons became one of the few places in my life where nobody expected me to solve anything. At work, people relied on me. Inside my family, people relied on me. Everywhere I went, I somehow became the person responsible for handling problems. Grandma was the only person who ever asked whether I was tired of carrying them. My younger sister Vanessa lived a completely different life. Vanessa had spent 32 years attracting attention without appearing to ask for it. Teachers loved her. Relatives adored her. Friends seemed to orbit around her naturally. She always had a new idea, a new opportunity, or a new dream she was convinced would change her life. Sometimes those plans worked briefly. Most of the time they didn't. Somehow she always landed safely anyway. Whenever something went wrong, help appeared. Whenever money became a problem, solutions arrived. Nobody seemed concerned by the pattern because the family had developed a simple explanation. Vanessa needed support. Families support each other. End of discussion. Looking back now, I realize how rarely anyone asked where that support actually came from. The funeral took place on a cold Thursday morning outside Boulder beneath a gray sky that threatened rain all day. Family members gathered around the gravesite while stories about Grandma's life drifted through the wind. People described her generosity, her determination, and her strength. Every word was true. Yet as I stood there listening, I couldn't stop thinking about something she said to me a few months earlier. We had been sitting in her kitchen when she suddenly looked up from her coffee and asked whether I believed people become entitled gradually or all at once. I remember laughing because the question seemed completely random. She smiled and told me entitlement works like rust. Nobody notices it while it's forming. People only notice it after the damage becomes impossible to ignore. Then she changed the subject. At the time I thought it was just another one of Grandma's strange observations. Standing at her funeral, however, I found myself remembering it for reasons I couldn't explain. After the service ended, the family drove downtown for the reading of the will. The meeting took place inside a conference room overlooking rain-covered streets and gray office buildings. There were 9 people present. My parents sat together near the center of the table. Vanessa sat beside Mom. Several relatives occupied seats along the opposite side. My grandfather sat quietly near the window while attorney Richard Lawson prepared the documents in front of him. Nobody said much because everyone was thinking about the same thing. Grandma's estate was substantial. There was the family home, investment accounts, a lake property, and several assets nobody knew much about. Personally, I wasn't interested in inheriting money. What mattered to me was something else. Grandma believed deeply in fairness. Not equality. Fairness. She used to say those were completely different ideas. Equality gives everyone the same thing. Fairness gives people what reality says they deserve. The attorney began reading the will in a calm, professional voice. The opening sections were exactly what everyone expected. Legal language. Property descriptions. Financial details. Then he turned a page and read a sentence that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room. According to the will, the majority of Evelyn Morgan's estate would pass directly to Vanessa Morgan. At first I assumed additional details would follow. Instead, every major asset seemed to move in the same direction. The house went to Vanessa. The investment accounts went to Vanessa. The lake property went to Vanessa. One asset after another carried the same destination. Confusion spread slowly around the table because the decision felt completely inconsistent with everything Grandma had ever believed. I wasn't angry. More than anything, I was confused. Then I glanced toward my mother and noticed an expression that immediately unsettled me. The look lasted less than a second before disappearing, but it was there. It wasn't grief. It wasn't surprise. It looked like relief, the kind people feel when uncertainty finally resolves itself exactly the way they hoped it would. Eventually, the attorney reached the end of the will and closed the document. Relatives exchanged uncertain looks while Vanessa appeared just as surprised as everyone else. For a moment it seemed as though the meeting was over. Then the attorney opened a drawer, removed a sealed cream-colored envelope with my grandmother's handwriting across the front, and placed it carefully on the table. The room immediately became silent again as every person present realized there was more to this story than the inheritance itself.
The attorney explained that Grandma left specific instructions regarding the envelope. The letter inside could only be opened after the will had been read, and only if every person named in the document was present. As he spoke, I found myself looking toward my grandfather. Unlike everyone else in the room, he didn't appear confused, curious, or surprised. Instead, he looked like a man who had been waiting a very long time for a particular moment to arrive. Watching him sit there while rain slid down the windows behind him and Grandma's unopened letter rested on the table between us, I experienced a feeling I couldn't fully explain. For the first time that afternoon, I began to suspect that the inheritance wasn't actually the story. It was simply the event that made the real story impossible to avoid.
The attorney didn't open the envelope immediately, and looking back, I think that delay mattered more than any of us realized at the time. Up until then, everyone in the room had been reacting to the will. Relatives were comparing expectations against reality. Vanessa looked stunned. My father stared silently at the table. My mother appeared calm in a way that felt strangely out of place. The inheritance had already created confusion, but confusion is manageable because people assume answers will eventually arrive. The envelope changed that. Suddenly, the inheritance stopped feeling like an answer and started feeling like a question. There was something unsettling about seeing my grandmother's handwriting after hearing her final legal instructions. The will felt official. The envelope felt personal. More importantly, it felt intentional. The attorney explained that the letter had been delivered to his office almost 18 months earlier with very specific instructions. It was to remain sealed. It was not to be copied. It was not to be discussed. And under no circumstances was it to be opened before the will had been read completely. Hearing that immediately caught my attention because 18 months was a long time. This wasn't something Grandma had written during her final days while reflecting on her life. She had prepared this letter long before her health began declining. That realization created an entirely new mystery. She spent a year and a half planning this moment, then whatever was inside that envelope mattered enough for her to think about it for a very long time. As the attorney carefully examined the seal, my thoughts drifted toward the final years of Grandma's life. The older I get, the more convinced I become that people reveal their priorities through patterns rather than words. Anyone can claim they care about something. The real question is what they consistently pay attention to. During the last few years of her life, Grandma became increasingly interested in details most people ignored. At the time, I assumed it was simply a result of getting older. Retired people have more time to observe things. They notice conversations. They remember dates. They compare stories. Looking back now, however, I realized something else was happening. She wasn't becoming more curious. She was becoming more suspicious. About 2 years before her death, we were sitting in her kitchen drinking coffee when she asked me a question that seemed completely random. She wanted to know whether I believed people become entitled gradually or suddenly. I remember laughing because the question felt disconnected from everything we had been discussing. When I asked what she meant, she told me entitlement works like rust. Nobody notices it while it's forming. People only notice it after the damage becomes impossible to ignore. Then she changed the subject and started talking about one of her neighbors. At the time I thought nothing of it. Sitting in that conference room years later, however, the memory felt very different. It felt less like a random observation and more like a clue I failed to understand. The attorney finally broke the seal and removed several pages from inside the envelope. Nobody spoke while he unfolded them. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was focused. Every person in the room seemed aware that whatever happened next had been carefully planned by a woman who rarely did anything without a reason. Before reading, the attorney glanced around the table and confirmed that everyone named in the letter was present. That detail immediately increased my anxiety because it suggested the contents weren't general reflections or sentimental farewell messages. This was directed communication. Specific communication. The kind people leave behind when they want something understood exactly as intended. Then the attorney began reading. The first paragraph surprised everyone because it didn't mention money, property, or inheritance at all. Instead, Grandma wrote about truth. She explained that families often survive on stories people agree not to question. Stories about sacrifice. Stories about responsibility. Stories about fairness. Over time, those stories become so familiar that nobody bothers checking whether they're actually true. What struck me immediately was how different the letter felt from the will. The legal document had been technical and impersonal. The letter sounded unmistakably like Grandma. Direct. Observant. Patient. The same voice I had listened to for years was suddenly sitting in the room with us again. As the attorney continued reading, the atmosphere grew noticeably heavier. Grandma explained that during the final years of her life she became increasingly interested in the difference between appearance and reality. According to her, most families eventually develop narratives that everyone accepts because questioning them creates discomfort. Over time, those narratives become more powerful than the truth itself. As I listened, I found myself glancing toward my mother. Something about Grandma's words seemed to affect her differently than everyone else. It wasn't fear exactly. It was recognition. The kind of expression people wear when a conversation starts moving toward a subject they hoped would never be discussed. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Grandma wrote that she had spent nearly 2 years quietly verifying assumptions she once accepted without question. The room became noticeably still because nobody understood what she meant yet, but everyone suddenly wanted to. For the first time since the reading began, I realized Grandma's letter wasn't explaining the inheritance. It was explaining why she made it. The attorney lowered his eyes to the next page and continued reading while the rain tapped steadily against the conference room windows. Nobody interrupted him now. The inheritance that had dominated everyone's attention 30 minutes earlier no longer seemed important. Every person in the room was focused on the same thing. The letter. More specifically, the investigation hidden inside the letter. What had started as a routine reading of a will was slowly transforming into something much larger. And judging by the increasingly uncomfortable way my mother kept adjusting her hands beneath the table, I wasn't the only person beginning to realize it. Whatever Grandma had spent 2 years investigating, she clearly believed it was important enough to explain before anyone could understand her final decisions. According to the next section of the letter, the first crack in the family story appeared during an ordinary dinner nearly 3 years earlier. Nothing dramatic happened that night. Nobody argued. Nobody confessed to anything. In fact, if someone had asked the rest of the family about that dinner, most of them probably wouldn't have remembered it. Grandma explained that she only remembered it because of something small. Vanessa had been talking about one of her latest business ideas while relatives praised my parents for supporting her through difficult times. It was a conversation everyone in the family had heard before. People admired my parents for their generosity. People talked about how much they sacrificed. People described them as the reason Vanessa always managed to recover from setbacks. According to Grandma, the conversation felt perfectly normal until she started asking simple follow-up questions later that week. The answers she received didn't match as neatly as she expected. The attorney continued reading while several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Grandma wrote that curiosity led her to begin comparing stories. Not investigating. Not accusing. Simply comparing. When she asked different family members where support came from, she discovered something strange. Nobody seemed completely sure. Some believed my parents financed everything. Others assumed money came from shared family resources. A few admitted they had never really thought about it at all. The inconsistency bothered her because people are usually very confident when discussing facts they understand. Confusion tends to appear when people are repeating information they never personally verified. According to Grandma, that realization planted a question she couldn't stop thinking about. If everyone believed the same story, why did nobody seem capable of explaining it clearly? Over the following months, Grandma began paying closer attention. She listened more carefully during family gatherings. She compared conversations that happened weeks apart. She noticed which topics made people comfortable and which topics made them change the subject. The more she observed, the more she noticed a pattern emerging beneath the surface of ordinary discussions. Whenever the subject involved responsibility, sacrifice, or financial support, the same names consistently received recognition. The same people were praised. The same people were described as generous. Yet according to Grandma, something about the pattern felt incomplete. Recognition and reality rarely aligned as perfectly as everyone assumed they did. The discrepancy was subtle enough that most people never noticed it, but once she saw it, she couldn't ignore it. Grandma explained that she eventually decided to verify her assumptions the same way she approached every important decision throughout her life. She looked for evidence. According to the letter, she wasn't trying to expose anyone. She genuinely hoped she was mistaken. She hoped the inconsistencies had simple explanations. She hoped the confusion came from misunderstanding rather than deception. Unfortunately, the records she reviewed only made the situation more troubling. Every answer seemed to create another question. Every explanation revealed another contradiction. The deeper she looked, the more difficult it became to reconcile the family narrative with the information she was uncovering. What disturbed her most wasn't the possibility that someone had been dishonest. What disturbed her was the possibility that people had become so comfortable with the story they stopped caring whether it was true. As the attorney reached the final section of the page, the room felt noticeably different than it had at the beginning of the reading. Relatives who arrived expecting a simple discussion about inheritance were now sitting silently while Grandma described the early stages of an investigation nobody knew existed. According to her notes, the most important discovery during those first months wasn't financial at all. It was behavioral. The more questions she asked, the more she realized certain people became uncomfortable whenever conversations moved too close to specific subjects. Nobody became openly defensive. Nobody protested. Instead, discussions quietly changed direction. Topics shifted. Details disappeared. Attention moved elsewhere. According to Grandma, those reactions interested her far more than the documents themselves because numbers can reveal what happened, but behavior often reveals what people are trying to avoid. The final paragraph on the page contained a statement that immediately captured everyone's attention. Grandma wrote that after nearly a year of observation, she reached a conclusion she desperately hoped was wrong. Rather than searching for evidence that supported her theory, she began searching for evidence that could disprove it. If she misunderstood the situation, she wanted proof. If she was missing important information, she wanted to find it. According to her notes, every attempt to disprove her suspicions failed. Every conversation, every document, and every timeline pointed toward the same uncomfortable possibility. By that point, she was no longer asking whether the family story was incomplete. She was asking how many people already knew it was. And judging by the way my mother suddenly stopped looking at anyone else in the room, I had the growing feeling that the answer to that question was about to change everything. The attorney turned the page and continued reading while the room remained completely silent. By that point, nobody seemed interested in the inheritance anymore. The house, the investment accounts, and the lake property had become secondary. Every person sitting around that conference table was focused on the same question. What exactly had Grandma discovered? More importantly, why had she spent nearly 2 years investigating her own family instead of simply confronting them? The answer, according to the next section of the letter, was both simpler and more troubling than anyone expected. Grandma wrote that the deeper she looked, the more she realized the problem wasn't a single lie. It was a story that had been repeated so often everyone eventually accepted it as truth. According to her notes, the first major breakthrough happened when she stopped paying attention to money and started paying attention to gratitude. At first, that seemed like a strange place to look. Gratitude doesn't appear on bank statements. It doesn't leave paper trails. Yet Grandma explained that gratitude reveals what people genuinely believe. When someone repeatedly thanks a particular person for solving problems, they are revealing who they think deserves credit. Over several months, she began documenting those moments. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations, casual conversations. Every time someone expressed appreciation, she paid attention to who received it. The pattern that emerged disturbed her more than any financial inconsistency she had uncovered. Recognition consistently flowed toward the same people while responsibility seemed to flow somewhere else entirely. The attorney continued reading while several relatives sat frozen in thought. Grandma wrote that she eventually started comparing praise against evidence. Whenever someone was described as generous, she checked whether the records supported that description. Whenever someone was praised for helping, she looked for proof of that help. At first, she assumed the results would be mixed. Instead, they were surprisingly one-sided. The people receiving the most recognition weren't always the people carrying the greatest responsibility. In several cases, they weren't carrying much responsibility at all. According to Grandma, that realization forced her to confront a possibility she had spent months avoiding. The family wasn't simply misunderstanding reality. The family had gradually built an entirely different version of reality and then started treating it as fact. As I listened, memories began surfacing faster than I could process them. I remembered holiday dinners where relatives praised my parents for helping Vanessa through another difficult period. I remembered conversations where people admired their generosity and sacrifice. I remembered standing in those same rooms while everyone discussed support as though it appeared from nowhere. At the time, those moments never bothered me because correcting them always felt unnecessary. The truth seemed obvious. Looking back, I realized the truth wasn't obvious at all. Most people weren't working from facts. They were working from assumptions. Assumptions repeated often enough eventually become beliefs. Beliefs repeated long enough eventually become family history. According to Grandma's letter, the most troubling discovery wasn't financial. The money simply exposed a larger problem. What truly disturbed her was how invisible responsibility had become. She explained that responsibility follows a predictable pattern. At first, people notice it. Then they appreciate it. Eventually, they rely on it. If enough time passes, they stop seeing it altogether. The dependable person becomes part of the background, like electricity or running water. Everyone benefits from it, but nobody thinks about it until it disappears. According to her notes, that realization explained almost everything she had been struggling to understand. The family wasn't intentionally ignoring certain contributions. They had become so accustomed to them that they no longer recognized them as contributions at all. The attorney paused briefly before continuing, and for the first time I noticed staring at the table instead of the letter. Earlier she looked confused. Now she appeared unsettled. There was a difference. Confusion comes from missing information. Being unsettled comes from recognizing information you were never supposed to notice. Grandma wrote that she spent months asking herself whether anyone was truly responsible for what had happened. The answer she eventually reached surprised even her. The answer she eventually reached, most people weren't acting out of cruelty. According to the letter, most people weren't acting out of cruelty. Convenience is far more dangerous because it rarely feels wrong while it's happening. Convenience is far more dangerous because it rarely feels wrong while it's happening. They accept easy explanations. People tell themselves difficult conversations. Eventually, the arrangement becomes normal. And once something feels normal, very few people question it. Eventually, the arrangement becomes normal. And once something feels normal, very few people question it. The final section of the page, after nearly 18 months of observation, research, and documentation, she became absolutely certain of one thing. After nearly 18 months of observation, was fundamentally incomplete. Certain people had received credit they didn't fully earn. The family narrative had every responsibilities nobody fully incomplete. Most importantly, the imbalance had persisted for so long that many family members genuinely had carried responsibilities. That realization ultimately convinced her she could no longer remain silent. The imbalance had persisted for so long that many family members genuinely survive for another generation. That realization ultimately convinced her she could no longer remain silent. Finally become impossible. If she allowed the situation to continue, then came the sentence that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room. If she confronted it directly, of her investigation, there was at least about discovering what happened. Finally become it was about identifying exactly who knew the truth and who benefited from pretending the atmosphere inside the room. As the attorney reached for the next page, that the next stage of her investigation wasn't about discovering what happened, and something was about identifying exactly who than she wanted anyone to realize, who benefited from pretending they didn't. As the attorney reached for the next page, I noticed my mother's expression tighten for the first time all afternoon, and something told me the letter was moving closer to her than she wanted anyone to realize. The attorney turned to the next page while the tension inside the conference room became almost impossible to ignore. Earlier in the afternoon, everyone had arrived expecting answers about money. Now it felt as though we were sitting inside the final chapter of a mystery nobody knew existed. The inheritance no longer seemed important compared to the story hidden behind it. Grandma's letter had spent several pages explaining how she discovered the inconsistencies, how she verified them, and why she eventually stopped trusting the version of events the family accepted as fact. The next section finally addressed the question everyone was quietly asking. If the family narrative was incomplete, who knew it? More importantly, who benefited from keeping it that way? According to Grandma's notes, answering that question required her to stop looking at records and start looking at behavior. She wrote that during the second year of her investigation, she became less interested in financial transactions and more interested in reactions. Money could explain what happened, but reactions often explained why it happened. Over several months, she intentionally introduced specific topics into conversations and observed how different people responded. Sometimes she mentioned responsibility. Sometimes she mentioned sacrifice. Occasionally she asked simple questions about family support and waited to see who seemed uncomfortable. According to her notes, the results were remarkably consistent. Certain people reacted normally because they had nothing to hide. Others became noticeably cautious. Conversations changed direction. Details suddenly became vague. Subjects shifted before reaching uncomfortable territory. None of those reactions proved wrongdoing by themselves, but together they formed a pattern that became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The attorney continued reading while nobody moved. Grandma explained that one conversation changed the entire direction of her investigation. The discussion happened during a family dinner nearly 18 months before her death. The evening itself was completely ordinary. Relatives talked about work, vacations, and future plans. At some point, the subject shifted toward Vanessa and another one of her business ventures. Several family members praised my parents for continuing to support her through every setback. According to Grandma, what happened next lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it revealed more than months of research. My mother accepted every compliment without hesitation. She didn't correct anyone. She didn't clarify anything. She simply nodded and allowed the praise to continue. Grandma admitted that the moment might have seemed insignificant to everyone else in the room. To her, however, it felt like the missing piece she had been searching for. According to the letter, that realization forced her to ask a difficult question. Was the family narrative surviving because people believed it, or because certain people actively benefited from it? The difference mattered. A misunderstanding can be corrected. A useful illusion tends to protect itself. Over the following months, she began examining every interaction through that lens. Who gained recognition? Who gained sympathy? Who gained financial advantages? Who gained freedom from responsibility? The answers became increasingly uncomfortable. The same individuals seemed to benefit repeatedly while the same individuals quietly carried obligations nobody discussed. The imbalance was so consistent that eventually Grandma stopped viewing it as coincidence. Coincidences happen occasionally. Patterns repeat themselves. As I listened, I found myself remembering countless family gatherings from the previous decade. I remembered relatives praising my parents for sacrifices they supposedly made. I remembered hearing stories about support, generosity, and commitment. Most of all, I remembered how naturally everyone accepted those stories. Nobody questioned them because there appeared to be no reason to question them. Looking back, I realized something painful. The narrative had survived because it was convenient for almost everyone involved. It made certain people look generous. It made certain people feel grateful. It allowed difficult realities to remain hidden beneath simpler explanations. Convenience has a strange way of disguising itself as truth when enough people benefit from believing it. Grandma wrote that she eventually reached a conclusion she desperately hoped was wrong. According to her notes, the family story wasn't being protected by ignorance anymore. At least not entirely. Some people genuinely didn't know the truth, but others knew enough to recognize that something wasn't quite right. Instead of confronting the inconsistency, they chose silence. That silence allowed the narrative to survive year after year. The longer it survived, the harder it became to challenge because admitting the truth would require people to reevaluate their own behavior. Very few people enjoy doing that. It's much easier to continue believing a comfortable story than to examine the reality hiding underneath it. The final section of the page revealed why Grandma spent so much time documenting everything. She explained that accusations create arguments. Evidence creates accountability. If she confronted the family without proof, people would debate her conclusions. They would question her memory. They would defend themselves. If she presented evidence, however, the conversation changed completely. Facts don't eliminate denial, but they make denial much harder to sustain. According to her notes, that realization shaped every decision she made during the final year of her life. She wasn't preparing for a confrontation. She was preparing for a moment when the truth would have to stand on its own. Then came a sentence that immediately tightened the atmosphere around the table. Grandma wrote that after nearly 2 years of observation, she finally identified the person who understood the family narrative better than anyone else. The person wasn't simply benefiting from the story. According to her conclusions, that person had quietly helped maintain it. As the attorney reached for the next page, I noticed my mother's hands clasped together tightly on the table, and for the first time all afternoon she looked genuinely worried about what might come next. The attorney lowered his eyes to the next page and continued reading while a heavy silence settled over the conference room. By then, nobody seemed interested in pretending the letter was about inheritance anymore. Grandma had spent page after page carefully dismantling the story our family believed about itself, and now she was moving closer to the people responsible for keeping that story alive. What made the situation so uncomfortable was that nobody could claim ignorance anymore. The evidence she described wasn't vague. It wasn't based on feelings or assumptions. It was built from years of observation, documented patterns, and conclusions she had challenged repeatedly before allowing herself to believe them. According to the letter, identifying the person who understood the narrative best became the most important stage of her investigation because understanding the story and maintaining the story were two very different things. Grandma wrote that after months of comparing conversations, financial records, and family behavior, she finally stopped asking who benefited from the arrangement and started asking who depended on it. The distinction changed everything. Benefiting from something doesn't necessarily mean you're responsible for it. Depending on something is different. Dependence creates motivation. Motivation creates behavior. According to her notes, one individual consistently behaved as though the family narrative could never be allowed to change. Every conversation that approached uncomfortable territory was redirected. Every question that risked exposing inconsistencies received a carefully managed explanation. Every opportunity to clarify reality somehow resulted in the same familiar story being reinforced instead. At first, Grandma believed these incidents were isolated. Eventually, she realized they were connected. The attorney continued reading while my mother stared motionlessly at the table. Grandma explained that the breakthrough came during a private conversation she had nearly a year before her death. The discussion began innocently enough. They were talking about family finances, future plans, and responsibilities. At some point, Grandma introduced a hypothetical scenario. She asked what would happen if the person carrying the greatest burden suddenly stopped. According to the letter, the answer arrived immediately. There was no hesitation. No confusion. No need to think. Instead of expressing concern for the individual involved, the response focused entirely on the consequences everyone else would face. Bills would become problems. Plans would collapse. Expectations would need adjustment. Several people would suddenly be forced to take responsibility for situations they had avoided for years. According to Grandma, that reaction revealed something she had been struggling to prove. The support system had become so normal that people no longer viewed it as support. They viewed it as infrastructure. That realization disturbed her more than any financial discovery. Infrastructure isn't appreciated. It's expected. People notice it only when it disappears. According to her notes, the family had gradually transformed one person's sacrifices into a permanent feature of reality. The arrangement became so familiar that nobody stopped to ask whether it was fair. Nobody questioned how much responsibility one person could reasonably carry. Most importantly, nobody seemed interested in acknowledging the true source of the stability everyone enjoyed. Grandma admitted that understanding this was painful because it forced her to confront a truth she had overlooked for years. She had witnessed the pattern herself without fully recognizing it. Like everyone else, she accepted the family narrative because it was easier than examining the reality hidden underneath it. As the attorney turned another page, I noticed several relatives exchanging uncomfortable glances. The room felt smaller than before, as though every paragraph reduced the distance between Grandma's conclusions and the people sitting around the table. According to the letter, the problem was never that certain family members received help. Families are supposed to help each other. The problem was that help had evolved into entitlement. Entitlement had evolved into expectation. Expectation had evolved into a system where recognition and responsibility no longer belonged to the same people. The longer the system survived, the more normal it appeared. Eventually, the arrangement stopped looking unusual altogether. That, according to Grandma, was the most dangerous stage of any unhealthy pattern. Once people begin treating something unfair as normal, they stop questioning it completely. The next section of the letter explained why she changed her estate plan. For months she wrestled with the decision because she understood how it would appear from the outside. People would see the will and assume she was rewarding one person over another. They would focus on the distribution rather than the reason behind it. Yet every alternative she considered led back to the same problem. If she ignored what she discovered, the family narrative would survive untouched. If she confronted it directly while she was alive, the discussion would become emotional and defensive. According to her notes, she eventually realized the only way to expose the truth was to create a situation where everyone would be forced to confront it together. Not through accusations, through evidence. The final paragraph on the page immediately changed the atmosphere in the room because Grandma revealed something she had never mentioned before. During the last 6 months of her life, she conducted one final test. A simple test designed to answer a single question. She intentionally gave several family members opportunities to acknowledge the truth voluntarily. No pressure. No confrontation. No accusations. Just opportunities. According to her notes, the results told her everything she needed to know. Some people came close to honesty before changing the subject. Others avoided the topic entirely. One person admitted more than they realized. And one person, according to Grandma, confirmed her suspicions completely. As the attorney reached for the next page, I noticed my mother's expression tighten for a fraction of a second before she quickly looked away. And for the first time all afternoon, I had the unmistakable feeling that the letter was no longer approaching the truth. It had arrived there. The attorney turned to the next page while nobody in the room seemed willing to break the silence. Earlier that afternoon, people had been confused. Now they looked trapped between disbelief and recognition. Grandma's investigation had moved beyond patterns and assumptions. She was no longer explaining what she suspected. She was explaining what she concluded. According to the letter, the final test she conducted during the last 6 months of her life wasn't designed to catch anyone doing something wrong. It was designed to measure honesty. More specifically, it was designed to determine whether the people closest to the situation would tell the truth when given an opportunity to do so. The answer, unfortunately, was not what she hoped it would be. Grandma wrote that she created several conversations that appeared completely ordinary on the surface. During family dinners, private visits, and casual discussions, she intentionally introduced topics connected to responsibility, support, and sacrifice. Then she listened. Sometimes she asked direct questions. Other times she simply made observations and waited to see whether anyone corrected them. According to her notes, the pattern remained remarkably consistent. People recognized pieces of the truth. Some recognized large pieces of it. Yet almost nobody seemed willing to acknowledge the entire picture. Every conversation stopped just short of complete honesty, as though everyone could see the reality sitting in front of them but preferred not to look directly at it. The closer discussions moved toward uncomfortable territory, the more quickly they changed direction. The attorney continued reading while several relatives stared down at the table. Grandma explained that one particular conversation stood apart from all the others because it revealed something she had spent nearly 2 years trying to understand. The discussion happened during an ordinary afternoon visit and lasted less than 20 minutes. Nothing dramatic occurred. No argument took place. No confession was made. Yet by the time the conversation ended, she finally understood why the family narrative survived for so long. According to the letter, the person involved wasn't trying to deceive anyone. In fact, they believed they were being completely honest. That honesty was exactly what made the conversation so important. According to Grandma's notes, the individual casually explained that if Claire ever stopped helping, several family members would immediately face serious problems. Financial plans would change. Expectations would collapse. Responsibilities would need to be redistributed. The statement was delivered so naturally that it almost sounded obvious. That was the moment everything finally clicked into place. The support system had become so deeply embedded in family life that people no longer viewed it as support. They viewed it as something permanent, something dependable, something that simply existed. According to Grandma, that realization disturbed her because it explained why gratitude had gradually disappeared. People tend to appreciate sacrifices they view as temporary. They stop noticing sacrifices they believe are permanent. The next section of the letter contained one of the most painful conclusions she reached during the entire investigation. According to her observations, the greatest damage wasn't financial. Money can be replaced. Opportunities can be recovered. The greatest damage occurred when one person's generosity became invisible. Over time, responsibility stopped looking like responsibility and started looking like obligation. Once that transformation happened, appreciation slowly faded. Expectations took its place. According to Grandma, this was the stage where unhealthy family dynamics become self-sustaining because nobody feels responsible for correcting them anymore. Everyone simply adapts to them and continues moving forward. As I listened, memories from the previous decade kept replaying in my head. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations. Dozens of moments where people praised the wrong sacrifices, thanked the wrong individuals, and repeated the same narrative without questioning it. Looking back, I realized something that hurt more than I expected. The story survived not because it was believable but because it was convenient. It allowed certain people to feel generous. It allowed others to avoid uncomfortable responsibilities. Most importantly, it prevented anyone from asking questions that might disrupt the arrangement. The final paragraph on the page revealed why Grandma ultimately changed her estate plan. According to her notes, she realized that exposing the truth wasn't enough. People forget conversations. They argue about memories. They reinterpret events to protect themselves. If she wanted the reality to survive after she was gone, she needed something stronger than a discussion. She needed proof. More importantly, she needed a moment that would force everyone to confront that proof at the same time. The inheritance, the trust, and even the letter itself were all parts of the same plan. They were never separate decisions. They were pieces of a single solution. Then came the sentence that immediately tightened every muscle in my body. Grandma wrote that the next page contained the final conclusion of her investigation and the real reason she had rewritten her will. As the attorney reached for the next sheet of paper, nobody in the room looked away because everyone understood that the explanation we had been waiting for was finally about to arrive. The attorney lowered his eyes to the final pages of Grandma's letter and continued reading while the silence inside the conference room became almost unbearable. By then, nobody seemed interested in pretending this was still a discussion about inheritance. The will, the property, and even the trust had become secondary to the truth Grandma had spent nearly 2 years uncovering. Every person in the room understood that we had reached the conclusion of her investigation. More importantly, we had reached the reason she changed her estate plan. According to the letter, everything she had documented, every conversation she recorded, every inconsistency she verified, and every pattern she studied ultimately led to a single realization. The family didn't suffer from a lack of resources. It suffered from a lack of honesty. Grandma wrote that after months of observation, she stopped asking who benefited from the arrangement because the answer had become obvious. Instead, she started asking who paid for it. That question produced a very different result. According to her notes, whenever she followed the trail of responsibility, sacrifice, and financial stability, it consistently led back to the same person. Not the person receiving praise. Not the person receiving sympathy. Not the person receiving recognition. The same individual appeared repeatedly behind situations that everyone else treated as normal. According to Grandma, that discovery forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. The family had become so accustomed to one person's reliability that they no longer viewed it as extraordinary. They viewed it as expected. The attorney continued reading while nobody moved. Grandma explained that she spent several months trying to convince herself she was being unfair. She reviewed her notes repeatedly. She challenged her own conclusions. She searched for evidence that might prove her wrong. Instead, every new piece of information reinforced the same reality. The more she examined the situation, the more obvious it became that one family member had quietly carried responsibilities that should have been shared by several people. What disturbed her most wasn't the imbalance itself. Families go through difficult periods all the time. What disturbed her was how completely invisible that imbalance had become. People noticed the benefits. They noticed the results. They noticed the stability. Yet almost nobody seemed interested in acknowledging the source. According to the next section of the letter, that realization changed the way she viewed fairness. For most of her life, she believed fairness meant treating people equally. During the final years of her life, she realized fairness sometimes requires something more difficult. It requires recognizing realities other people prefer to ignore. She wrote that rewarding appearances while ignoring contributions creates resentment, even when nobody intends harm. Eventually, the wrong lessons get reinforced. Responsibility becomes invisible. Entitlement becomes normal. Gratitude slowly disappears. According to Grandma, that process had been happening inside our family for years, and almost nobody recognized it because the transition happened gradually enough to feel natural. As the attorney turned another page, I noticed Vanessa staring at the table with an expression I had never seen before. She looked less confused now and more reflective, as though she was replaying years of memories through a completely different lens. Grandma wrote that one of the hardest conclusions she reached involved Vanessa herself. According to her observations, Vanessa wasn't the architect of the family narrative. She was a beneficiary of it. There was an important difference. Beneficiaries accept systems that already exist. Architects create them. While Vanessa undoubtedly benefited from the arrangement, the evidence suggested she genuinely believed many of the stories surrounding it. That realization brought Grandma no comfort because unintentional damage still creates consequences. Nevertheless, she felt it was important to distinguish between someone who knowingly builds an illusion and someone who grows up inside one. The final section of the page revealed why the will appeared so shocking at first glance. Grandma explained that she intentionally designed it to create a question before providing an answer. People saw the trust first, they would immediately understand her reasoning. If they saw the inheritance first, however, they would experience the same confusion she experienced when she first began examining the family narrative. They would be forced to ask why. According to her notes, asking why is the first step toward understanding. Without that question, most people would simply accept the outcome and move on. She wanted something different. She wanted the truth to be examined before it was understood. Then came the sentence that immediately changed the atmosphere around the table. Grandma wrote that the next page contained the most important decision she made during the final year of her life and the reason the attorney had been instructed to keep reading after the letter ended. As the attorney carefully reached for the final sheet, I noticed my grandfather close his eyes briefly before looking back toward the window. It wasn't the reaction of someone hearing new information. It looked like the reaction of someone preparing for a truth he already knew was coming. And for the first time since the reading began, I had the unmistakable feeling that the inheritance Vanessa received wasn't the ending of Grandma's plan. It was merely the beginning of it. The attorney carefully lifted the final page of Grandma's letter and adjusted it on the table in front of him. By then, nobody in the room seemed capable of focusing on anything except the words he was reading. The confusion surrounding the inheritance had been replaced by something much heavier. Understanding. Not complete understanding, but enough to realize that Grandma's decisions had never been random. Every page of the letter had revealed another layer of a story most of us didn't even know existed. The inheritance, the investigation, the trust, and the carefully planned reading of the will were all connected. According to Grandma, none of it was designed to punish anyone. It was designed to force reality into a room where reality had been absent for far too long. Grandma wrote that during the final year of her life, she spent countless hours considering what fairness actually meant. The question troubled her because the answer wasn't as simple as she once believed. If fairness meant dividing everything equally, the estate could have been settled in a single afternoon. Nobody would have complained. Nobody would have questioned her motives. The problem was that equality would have rewarded the family narrative instead of the truth. According to her notes, she eventually realized that treating everyone the same after years of unequal responsibility wasn't fairness at all. It was avoidance. It allowed people to ignore the very realities she had spent 2 years uncovering. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that her final decisions needed to reflect facts rather than appearances. The attorney continued reading while every relative sat completely motionless. Grandma explained that the most important discovery of her investigation wasn't financial. It wasn't even emotional. The most important discovery was recognizing how easily people confuse visibility with value. Some contributions are obvious. They happen in public. They attract attention and praise. Other contributions happen quietly. They occur behind the scenes. They prevent problems before anyone notices those problems existed. According to Grandma, families often celebrate visible effort while overlooking invisible sacrifice. Over time, the imbalance becomes so normal that nobody notices it anymore. That realization haunted her because the evidence suggested it had been happening inside our family for years. According to the next section of the letter, the purpose of the estate plan was never to reward popularity, sympathy, or appearances. The purpose was to acknowledge reality. She wrote that reality can be uncomfortable because it forces people to confront things they would rather ignore. It forces difficult conversations. It creates accountability. Most importantly, it removes the protection that comfortable stories provide. Grandma admitted that she knew many people would disagree with her decisions before they understood them. She accepted that possibility because she believed something more important was at stake. If the truth remained hidden, the same unhealthy pattern would continue long after she was gone. If the truth became impossible to ignore, there was at least a chance the future could look different from the past. As the attorney turned to the final portion of the page, the atmosphere inside the conference room felt completely different from the one that existed at the beginning of the afternoon. Relatives who arrived expecting a routine reading of a will were now sitting in silence while years of assumptions collapsed around them. Grandma wrote that after months of consultation with attorneys, financial advisors, and legal professionals, she created a structure designed to accomplish two goals. The first goal was to expose the truth. The second goal was to ensure that truth carried lasting consequences. According to her notes, exposing a problem without correcting it accomplishes very little. Real change requires action. Without action, people eventually return to old habits and familiar narratives. Then came the paragraph that immediately captured everyone's attention. Grandma explained that the will we heard at the beginning of the meeting was intentionally incomplete. It wasn't false. Every asset listed for Vanessa genuinely belonged to her under the terms of the estate. What the will did not explain was what happened after the letter. According to Grandma, revealing everything at once would have defeated the purpose of the plan. People needed to understand the reason before they understood the outcome. That was why the attorney had been instructed to continue reading. That was why the trust remained hidden. That was why the investigation came before the explanation. She wanted every person in the room to confront the evidence before learning what she ultimately decided to do with it. The final paragraph on the page contained the sentence that immediately caused several relatives to sit forward in their chairs. Grandma wrote that upon completion of the letter, the attorney would be instructed to present a second legal document prepared during the final months of her life. According to her notes, that document contained the most important decision she ever made regarding the estate and represented the conclusion of everything she had spent 2 years trying to understand. As the attorney lowered the page and reached toward a separate folder resting beside him on the table, I felt my heart begin beating faster. Around me, nobody seemed capable of looking away. The investigation was over. The explanations were complete. Whatever happened next would determine whether Grandma's final plan truly changed anything at all. And judging by the expression on my mother's face, she was beginning to realize that the outcome she celebrated at the beginning of the meeting might not be the outcome she was leaving with. The attorney remained silent for several seconds after setting Grandma's final page aside. Nobody in the room spoke. Nobody seemed willing to interrupt what felt like the conclusion of something much larger than a discussion about inheritance. Throughout the afternoon, Grandma's letter had slowly dismantled a family narrative that many of us accepted for years without questioning it. She had explained how she uncovered inconsistencies, how she verified her suspicions, and how she eventually discovered that responsibility and recognition were flowing in completely different directions. Now, for the first time since the reading began, we had reached the moment her entire plan had been building toward. The attorney opened the second folder resting beside him and carefully removed several documents before looking around the room to confirm that everyone was paying attention. According to the legal instructions attached to the file, the document was a separate trust agreement created during the final year of Grandma's life. Unlike the will, which distributed visible assets, the trust controlled a collection of financial accounts, investment holdings, and private assets that had not been discussed during the earlier reading. The attorney explained that the trust existed independently of the estate and therefore followed entirely different instructions. As he began listing the contents, confusion quickly spread around the room. The value of the trust was substantial. In fact, by the time he finished describing the assets involved, it became obvious that the trust represented a significant portion of Grandma's total wealth. More importantly, it contained the resources everyone assumed had already been distributed through the will. The attorney continued reading while every relative sat motionless. According to the trust agreement, the sole beneficiary was Claire Morgan. For a moment, nobody reacted because the words seemed difficult to process. Earlier that afternoon, everyone watched Vanessa inherit the house, the lake property, and several major assets. Now we were learning that the largest financial structure Grandma created belonged entirely to me. The attorney explained that Grandma intentionally separated the estate because she wanted people to understand the reason before they understood the outcome. Had the trust been revealed first, the letter would have felt unnecessary. Had the letter never been read, the trust would have felt confusing. Together, however, they told the same story. One explained the problem. The other reflected her response to it. As the reality of the trust settled over the room, I found myself looking toward Vanessa. To my surprise, she wasn't angry. She wasn't outraged. She looked overwhelmed. Throughout the reading, she had listened to Grandma's observations with growing discomfort, and by now it was obvious she understood why the trust existed. According to everything Grandma documented, the issue was never whether Vanessa deserved help. The issue was that one person's sacrifices became invisible while everyone else's contributions remained visible. For the first time all afternoon, it felt as though Vanessa was seeing the same pattern Grandma spent years documenting. Looking back, I think that realization affected her more than the financial outcome ever could. The attorney then unfolded one final page attached to the trust documents. Unlike the rest of the legal paperwork, this page contained a short handwritten message from Grandma. She wrote that the trust was not intended as compensation because no amount of money could compensate for years of invisible responsibility. It was not intended as revenge because revenge rarely solves anything. Instead, it was recognition. According to Grandma, the greatest injustice she discovered wasn't financial. It was the fact that one person's sacrifices became so normal that people stopped noticing them entirely. She wrote that responsibility deserves acknowledgement, especially when it is carried quietly. More importantly, she wanted at least one person in the family to hear the truth stated clearly while she still had the ability to say it. The room remained silent while the attorney finished reading the message. Eventually, relatives began processing what they had heard. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked reflective. A few appeared shocked by how completely their assumptions had been challenged. My father stared at the table for a long time before quietly wiping his eyes. My mother remained motionless. The relief I noticed at the beginning of the meeting had disappeared completely. In its place was the expression of someone confronting a reality she could no longer explain away. For years, the family narrative protected certain beliefs. Grandma's letter removed that protection. Whether people liked the outcome or not, the evidence now existed in front of everyone. The months that followed changed the family more than I expected. Vanessa eventually called and apologized for things she admitted she never questioned before. Several relatives reached out with uncomfortable honesty. My father began speaking more openly than he had in years. Even my mother, after months of silence, eventually acknowledged parts of the truth she spent a long time avoiding. None of those conversations fixed the past. Some things cannot be fixed. They can only be understood. Surprisingly, that turned out to be enough. Looking back now, I don't think Grandma's final act was really about inheritance. Most people who hear this story focus on the money because money is easy to understand. What I remember is something else entirely. I remember a woman who spent her final years refusing to ignore what everyone else accepted. I remember someone who understood that responsibility becomes dangerous when it turns invisible and that families sometimes confuse familiarity with fairness. Most of all, I remember her final lesson. The people carrying the heaviest weight are often the people nobody notices until they stop carrying it. By then, everyone suddenly realizes how much of their world was resting on shoulders they barely acknowledged at all. That was the truth Grandma wanted remembered, and in the end, it was the only inheritance that mattered.